In Jesus' time, there is absolutely no difference between religion and politics. I don't mean to say that they use the same language or exist in the same field. I literally mean there is no difference whatsoever between religion and politics. They are one and the same.
In the time of Jesus, politics and religion were the same? Literally? What is Reza Aslan saying here? And what does it mean for our understanding of the historical Jesus, let alone our understanding of the Jesus of religion, the Jesus of the Christian faith? If religion and politics are literally the same thing in the time of Jesus, then how do we today begin to tease those two things apart? How do we tell where religion stops and politics begins?
When you just put Jesus into the real historical era, then you don't have to think of him as a crazy person. You don't have to think of him as the Son of God. He's really more natural just to understand as a political caricature, right? That is basically there to calm down the Messianic movement. This is really what Jesus becomes when you put him into the real history. He just becomes a political device.
That's scholar and author Joe Atwill talking to my friend Alex Sakuras from the excellent Skeptico podcast. What's interesting is that Joe is talking about that same hard-to-tease-apart relationship between religion at the time of Jesus and politics at the time of Jesus, just like Reza Aslan was speaking about. But they differ in one fundamental and profoundly significant way. For Reza, Jesus is a literal historic figure who walked the earth, whereas for Joe Atwill, Jesus is better understood as a fictional figure manufactured by the Romans for political purposes.
He's actually one of the very few characters in literature that can be shown tip to stern to be fictional.
Did Jesus exist? Do people accept him as a historical figure? And a lot of new atheists say no.
Yeah, I had never even really heard that position, that people were legitimately out there saying that Jesus was not a historical figure.
That's Gerald Morgan Jr., who people will recognize from Stephen Crowder's YouTube channel and podcast. As I understand it, Gerald teaches Christianity in his own version of Christian apologetics, so it's surprising that he would say he was unaware that the question of whether or not Jesus was an actual historical figure is still very much an issue and very much debated. But it raises an even more interesting question that Alex zeroed in on with Joe Atwill in his conversation with him, and that is, should the question of whether or not Jesus was an actual historical figure be at the forefront of Christian thinking? Should it matter to Christians if Jesus existed? And if the politics of the time were so intertwined with the religion of the time as to be indistinguishable, then as Alex and Joe point out, figuring out which Jesus you believe in is crucial.
The question that I think people have to ask themselves is, am I part of an organization whose primary purpose is manipulation, control, and social structure, or am I following the wisdom of a genuine historical spiritual master who walked in this world? I do not understand for a second how a Christian can claim to be a Christian and not have this question be central to what they're about. And I would go one step further. I mean, this is very Joe Atwellian. If you don't care, then you're so far into the mind control project that is Christianity that you are probably a lost cause at the start. If this isn't a burning question to you, you're already bought into the cult aspect of the whole thing.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, if this isn't an important question, that means that reason has been turned off, and that basically you're a cult follower, even though you wouldn't want to admit it publicly. But if you aren't able to defend the historicity of Jesus, in my opinion, some part of your intellect has been switched off that is central to sort of living a rational life.
But wait a minute, a rational life. That's exactly what these Christian apologists are saying they're doing. Their entire point is that believing not just in Jesus' historicity, but in his divinity is the most rational response to the best available evidence. That's their claim, and they make it all of the time.
Best evidence points that he was a real person that lived during that time period and did die by crucifixion by the people, by Pontius Pilate.
We can be certain that Jesus Christ died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate.
And you can look at the facts, and then you can ask the question, what best explains the facts? And the reality is that today in the scholarship, the only explanation which is given any degree of credibility is the fact that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Every other explanation has been completely undermined, and so I think it is a rational decision to say that actually happened.
So there you have it. Not only is it rational to accept that Jesus rose from the dead, it's the only rational position to hold. Why? Because, according to the Christian apologists, it's the only explanation granted credibility by the scholars. Not only is that contrary to claims made by scholars like Joe Atwill and many others, I'm inclined to think that it's contrary to the views held by almost anybody outside of the world of Christian apologetics. The claim that the explanations for the stories of Jesus, other than the ones that affirm the religious interpretation, are the least plausible ones and have been dismissed by mainstream scholarship seems far-fetched, to say the least. So what is going on here? Everybody is claiming ownership to reason and truth. Everybody is claiming that their conclusions are the inevitable result of simply looking at the objective evidence. Everybody is claiming to have scholarship on their side, and everybody's accusing everybody who comes to different conclusions with privileging a particular agenda rather than privileging the truth. I don't know if Joe Atwill's conclusions are correct, but his arguments are persuasive. Everyone has their own interests. And don't kid yourself, strident atheists like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins are just as invested in their conclusions as the Christian apologists are invested in theirs. Ultimately, I think the explanation that Alex offers is the most plausible of all.
What I'd put is a natural defense mechanism that we all have, and it's called apologetics, and we normally associate it with Christian apologetics. It's starting with the conclusion that you want and working backwards to have the data fit. And what I think is really happening and will reveal itself more and more is the question is never about did Jesus exist? It's did your Jesus exist? Did the Jesus that you personally attach to, identify with, is important to you? Did that Jesus exist?
I mean, there's three categories. You have Jesus was God, Jesus was a man, and Jesus was a fictional character. The second two categories are equally, destructive to the first. If he was just a man, then there shouldn't be a Christian religion at this point. If he didn't exist, it's preposterous. So it doesn't matter if a scholar is in camp 2 or camp 3. It's not something that can be used as a basis for a religion. And what they're trying to do is to say, we can attack the idea of Jesus being a fictional character, not with evidence of Jesus having been in existence and a god, but rather there are scholars who believe that Jesus was a real man in the first century. And so that somehow this would, perhaps daunt the third argument, but should have nothing to do with the promotion of the first, that he was God.
A lot of people are not going to like Joe Atwill's conclusions. They strike at the heart of some very deeply held convictions, not just of faith, but of history. But we're faced with this issue of reason and truth, which is ultimately what this is all supposed to be about, for everyone, isn't it? So the question becomes, who is willing to put their deeply held convictions and preferred conclusions on the table? Who is willing to risk all of it for the truth?
In fact, for the Jews of Jesus' time, it was impossible for even their very movement was under the control of a Roman occupier, a heathen Roman occupier who lived thousands of kilometers away. This was, as I say, an intolerable situation for the Jews, which is why that Jesus' era was an era that was awash in apocalyptic expectation.
At this era, during this period leading up to the rebellion that was a full-throttle war between the Messianic movement and the Romans, there had been a series of rebellions. The rebellions began in the year 1. During the period of time that Jesus is supposedly walking around the countryside and talking about, turn the other cheek and give to Caesar what is Caesar, the countryside of Galilee was aflame with Messianic militarism. So this suggests that the character is not real. If you put the actual context of history around the character and look at him from that perspective, suddenly you have to question whether or not there is any reality to this Jesus Christ individual.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Brought peace?
Oh, peace! Shut